Welcome to another episode of my Wakeup Call. This is the podcast where I find out a little bit about my guests and I want to find out more. And in the process of finding out more, I want you, our listeners, and sometimes viewers, because our guests sometimes post the video. I know you want to listen into the story of my guests. So you're probably used to that. So let me tell you about Darryl Stickel and what attracted me to him. He's the author of Building Trust, Exceptional Leadership in an Uncertain World. The book's a practical and applied guide based on his 20 plus years of helping people solve trust-based problems. He has a PhD in business from Duke University and wrote his doctoral thesis on building trust in hostile environments. After working at McKinsey and Company, I guess that's a hostile environment, depending on where you are in the organization. And as a consultant, Darryl founded Trust Unlimited. Trust Unlimited has developed a set of virtual offerings intended to help people better apply the model to their own lives. Through his company, he has worked with a broad range of organizations and individuals, helping them understand what trust is, how it works, and how to build it. His clients are wide-ranging and have included financial services, telecoms, tech families, and the Canadian military in its attempts to build trust with the locals in Afghanistan. He's also spoken at some of the world's leading academic institutions and regularly exchanges thoughts and ideas with other leading scholars. So, Darryl, thank you for joining us today.
It's such a pleasure to be here, Mark.
Yeah, your trust is such a big issue. Something I've picked up from this organization that both of us attend, Metal, which is an organization for entrepreneurs. I remember the leader of Metal, kind of this charismatic impresario, Ken Rutkowski. I remember some months ago, he said, I don't even think people in business even care about trust anymore because they don't expect it. Basically, what they care about is, can they have confidence that you're going to do what you said you're going to do? Because if you don't, they'll sue you.
Right.
Who cares about trust? We'll sue you. I forget the big company that acquired, whether it was Microsoft or something. They said, okay, if we get sued, we'll take $1.5 billion haircut. But this is worth 10 billion to us, so let's go for it. And it's
right.
It's kind of crazy. But tell us about the through line in your life, how it is that trust became so central to you,
right,
and why your purpose of fighting the good fight to bring trust in you're a fool if you trust world.
Yeah. Wow. So I've always been sort of someone who feels that if you can help someone, you should. I was born in a small community in northern Canada, and it was fairly isolated. And when I grew up there was just a belief that people helped each other out, and that the strong protected the weak. And so I had this strong sense that if I was able to help people, I should do that. And I had a series of misadventures and challenges through my early life that gave me a sense of empathy for others when they were suffering or when they were struggling.
Can you share a couple of those so that we can really get a sense of empathy for you?
Yeah. So when I was about 7 years old, my father was involved in an automotive accident. He lost his leg and crushed a couple of vertebrae in his back, and cracked his pelvis and broke his hip. And he spent the rest of his life in pain and self-medicated with alcohol. And he had a tough, challenging life, and he was hard as old boot leather. And he and I struggled. We struggled to get along, and in part it was because we were similar, and in part it was because we were very different. And I
What was the similarity and what was the differences?
so in retrospect, I've realized that my father was resilient, and he fought hard. He could have retired and had a pension and never gone to work again, and he fought hard to get back to working and providing for his family in a way that he thought was appropriate. Um, but he was a welder, pipeline welder, and he really valued physical skills and those kinds of things. And imagine having a son who's mostly in his head. Um, I realized at an early age, I'm legally blind. I realized at an early age that I had to be able to think for a living when I grew up, because I wasn't going to be able to do things that required eyesight. Um,
What are you capable of seeing?
I tell people I can see a couple of feet. Usually they're my own. Um, if they're somebody else's, then I'm in trouble. But I see clearly for about 6 inches, and then after that, everything's blurry. I have something called cone dystrophy, which is a hereditary retinal disorder, and it's progressive, and so it has just gotten worse through my life. And my father struggled with that. He struggled with the fact that I had a disability, that I wasn't going to be able to do the things that he found value in. Um, and as someone with a grade 8 education, he struggled with the fact that I was going to study and be an academic eventually, and think for a living. He had a hard time understanding that. And I was blessed with an older brother who was fiercely protective. Fort St. John was a rough and tumble place when I grew up there, and my brother and his friends were strong and protective, and they allowed me to have a certain freedom to voice my opinions, to be outspoken when I thought things weren't right. If I thought something wasn't fair, I would say, "Hey, that's not fair," and uh, that rubbed my father the wrong way, but it also gave me a confidence to express my opinions. Um, and I had the shadow of my big brother always sort of looming over me and watching over me. Um, and so there were role models in my life for resilience and for being protective of others and for helping others. They just weren't the same role model. And so, I suffered a couple of concussions when I was a young man. When I was 4 years old, I was thrown from a horse. When I was 9 years old, I was knocked over and hit my head at a swimming pool. But when I was 17, I was playing junior hockey, and I was attacked by a fan with a club. And I was pulled partway into the crowd and uh, almost beaten to death. Um, I was in a smaller community, Fort Nelson, and I came through in the dressing room and then was rushed to the hospital. According to one of my teammates, I stopped breathing 3 times on the way to the hospital. Had a very severe concussion. And
Um, what were they angry at you about?
our team was winning, and I was the team captain. Um, we were a juvenile team playing in a junior league, and so we were 17 and 18-year-olds playing against up to 21-year-olds, and we were showing them up. We were beating the home team, and the game had gotten rough, and I was too close to the boards. There was a gap in the glass near the gate, at the gate, and a fan reached out and pulled me partway into the crowd. He had a club with him and shattered my helmet, and then I was pulled back onto the ice by teammates, and then one of their players grabbed me and started kicking me in the head with his skates on and slamming my head into the ice. And it was a moment of really profound violence. And it was 1984. We didn't know much about concussions. It was sort of, walk it off, you'll be fine. But I went from being on the honor roll to having the attention span of a fruit fly. And I slept all the time, and they didn't know what was wrong with me. And they kept sort of saying, well, maybe you've got mono, or maybe you've got chronic Epstein-Barr virus, or maybe you've got AIDS, maybe you've got leukemia, anything that had a component of fatigue associated with it. And so I was being tested for different things constantly. And it was a difficult journey, but sometimes Mark, a hard road is a good teacher. And so I learned about what it meant to be vulnerable and what it meant to potentially have everything taken away. Because as you'll recall, my vision was in decline. I was a good hockey player, but I knew that wasn't going to be a career because my eyesight was failing, and I couldn't engage in careers that were going to require eyesight. I needed to be able to think for a living, and now I couldn't do that. And so I went away to college and failed everything my first couple of years, and slowly started to recover and started studying psychology. But the thing that I found is that people would just approach me and tell me about their lives. I'd be sitting on a bus and someone would sit down next to me and say, I'm really having a hard time. And I thought, if this is going to keep happening to me, I should probably get paid for this. And so I started towards becoming a clinical psychologist. And I was studying psychology, and I was working with troubled teens and families in crisis and honing a lot of those skills. And then a lot of the folks I was working with, I realized I can see what the problem is. Social services would drop me into a family, and I could see where the problems lie. And I could even help them create a plan to move forward, but often they were just doing the best they could. And as a psychiatrist, I'm sure you've run into this many times, where you can see a path forward for people, but they just can't get there. And it's taken them a long time to get into a difficult place. It's going to take them a long time to get out. And I thought, this will drive me insane. And so I shifted directions and went into public administration, started working in native land claims in British Columbia. And as a research analyst, they would ask me deep philosophical questions like, what is self-government? Or what will the province look like 50 years after claims are settled? And the last question they asked me was, how do we convince a group of people we've shafted for over 100 years they should trust us? I thought, wow, that is a really good question. And it got to the heart of these sort of long-term disputes. And it called on several of the things that I'd learned through my journey, through the road that I had followed, where I had learned how to engage with people and connect with people, sometimes people who were very difficult. And I worked on crisis lines and with street kids, and was able to create strong relationships there very quickly. And so it had me curious about, well, how do I do that? And what are the things that I engage in that facilitates that for people, that makes people comfortable connecting? And so I started reading all the literature on trust and trying to understand it. Went to Duke and worked on my doctoral thesis. Had the good fortune of having two of the world's leading academics on the topic on my committee. A man named Sim Sitkin, who still teaches at Duke, and a woman named Karen Cook, who just recently retired from Stanford. They were both at Duke at the time. And they said, after I finished, we sat down for a drink, the three of us, and they said, when you first came to us, we had a conversation with each other, and we said, building trust in hostile environments, that's way too big. It's too complicated. He's going to take 6 months, and then he'll come crawling back to us and say, I just can't solve this. And we'll let him slice off a tiny portion of it, and that'll be his doctoral thesis. And I said, 6 months in, you were so far beyond us, we couldn't help anymore. All we could do was sit and watch. And here we are 2 years later, we think you've solved it. And so I guess the line that runs through my life is one of understanding people, having empathy, and then trying to help others understand each other and build stronger relationships.
Let me run something by you because you don't know it because you're just new to this podcast. My listeners and I have fallen in love with you.
Oh,
When PR companies reach out to me with their clients, I say, my listeners are listening for someone that they can not only trust, admire, respect, but someone that they could fall in love with
right.
because of something about them. And I would say to the PR companies, is your client lovable? And some of them would say, well, no. Okay, we'll send you some other people. But there's a decency and earnestness, a humility, a resilience. This episode's going to do very well.
Oh, thank you.
Well, I want to thank you. I want to thank you because it's and I'll share something with you because who knows, maybe we'll even talk after this. So I wrote a book called Just Listen, which did pretty well around the world. And a couple of years ago, I spoke in Moscow to 1,000 businessmen and businesswomen, and some of my books have done pretty well in Russia. And I headlined along with a Nobel Prize winner, Daniel Kahneman. He wrote Thinking Fast and Slow.
Yes.
And what I shared there, and it's something I'm continuing to want to share, and I'd welcome your thoughts on it, because this is a conversation, even though I have listened to you spellbound about your story and just your way of telling it. But what I did in Moscow, and I hadn't thought about, well, this is how you build trust, but maybe it is. What I said to the audience, I said, underneath you listening to me, you're listening for something.
Mm-hmm.
And if I just focus on you listening to me, and I'm entertaining, and I give you some bullet points, most of which will not work for you,
Right.
I'll get away with it, and you'll give me your mind for an hour. I said, but if I drop that and focus on what you're listening for, and I identify what you're listening for without you telling me, and I deliver on that, you'll give me everything.
Yeah.
And I said, I think what you're listening for, and this probably applies to almost all business audiences, is you're listening for something that will increase your measurable results, because that's how you get a raise or a promotion.
Mm-hmm.
And they went, da. And then I said, and you're listening for a way to do that that's less stressful, because you're all drinking too much, eating too much, your people are, it's really a mess.
Right.
And they went, da. And I said, most of all, you're listening for a way that's doable by you, and you don't have to buy a book. I haven't written this book. I still haven't written this book on what we're talking about. And you don't have to buy a course, because I haven't created the course. But if I could give you something that was doable by you immediately, that would get you better results, that's less stressful, it'll be worth all the money you spent in a day of your time to come here. Is that true? And they went, da. I said, sit down. I got to make a presentation here.
Nice.
But there's some synergy. I don't know what it is. And I've been trying to share with the world that whenever you're with one person, whenever you're with a group of people, if you can realize that they're all listening for something,
Right.
which is deeper than what they're listening to, and if you can just be curious what they're listening for, and have zero agenda other than to clarify it and serve it, the people will lean towards you.
Right.
So I just wanted to share that with you because I have a feeling we're going to have conversations after this podcast. But could you track with any of that? Did any of that make any sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And for me, so that really resonates. And for me, part of that is around, one of the topics that I talk about is benevolence. It's this having someone else's best interest at heart. And a lot of times I'll talk with leaders or I'll talk with people about benevolence. How do I show you that I have your best interest at heart? How do I show you that I care? And a lot of times leaders will say, well, I do that. But I work with families, and I'll say to parents, who here has their kids' best interest at heart? And all the hands go up. But when I flip that question and say, how many of your kids would say that? It's usually about a third, Mark. And it's somewhat hesitant. So if it's not clear where it's supposed to be incredibly clear, how clear is it for leaders? Right? How do we show that and have it land? And part of that's about including the other person in the conversation, but having a level of empathy and adopting the other's perspective. And you talked about Kahneman, his book's fantastic, the Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow book. What I try to teach people is to think slowly about their relationships, be more intentional, and actually include the other person in a conversation around, what does success look like for you? How do I help you get there? How do I show you that I'm thinking about you? And it doesn't always mean being nice, but it means having care and concern for the other person and having that land. And so a lot of times what I do is I'll talk to people about how to pull levers. I believe that trust is a combination of uncertainty and vulnerability. And when we're deciding to trust someone, we ask ourselves these two fundamental questions. How likely am I to be harmed, which is perceived uncertainty? And if I'm harmed, how bad is it going to hurt, which is perceived vulnerability? And we then make a decision about whether we trust somebody or not. And for me, it's a multiplicative endeavor. It's this uncertainty times vulnerability gives us a level of perceived risk. And if we feel like our risk perception goes beyond our threshold, we don't trust. And if it's beneath it, then we do. And so that means that building trust is actually really simple. How do I understand where uncertainty comes from? How do I understand where perceptions of vulnerability come from? And how do I take steps to reduce those? And the conversation you had with your audience is a brilliant example of pulling the benevolence lever, of saying, I'm thinking about you. I'm thinking about why you're here. And I'm going to check in with you to make sure that I'm right. And once we've reached an agreed upon place, then I'm going to start trying to show benevolence towards you. And you're going to interpret it that way. You're not going to think, wow, Mark accidentally stumbled on something that was really beneficial to me. He was thoughtful and intentional about it. And he showed that he cared about me as somebody in his audience, someone who was investing my time and energy and money to see him speak. And that's a powerful lever to pull.
Is there a difference between benevolence and generosity of spirit? Are they the same?
They're very similar, except that I think benevolence needs to be more focused. And so generosity of spirit is something where we're open to the world, we're giving, but we may not always be in alignment with what other people need. And so, as an example, my son wanted to get a baseball scholarship. And so he said, this is my goal. And so then I was able to come alongside and say, well, that means you need to eat well, means you need to exercise, means you need to study hard because you have to have good grades, means you need to get along well with your coach. These are all the factors that, because your coach is going to promote you, and you need to be a good teammate so that people will recommend you. And now all of a sudden I'm coaching him and nudging him on all these different dimensions. And his interpretation of that is not, wow, Dad's really generous. It's, Dad's got my back. Dad's asking me the hard questions because he wants me to do well. And a leader can have that same conversation with someone that they're leading, where they say, what does success look like for you? How do I help you get there? Okay, so now I need to hold you more accountable. Now I need to hold you to a higher standard because your aspirations are beyond just doing what you're doing. So I think there's an overlap, but I don't think it's completely aligned.
Yeah, something you mentioned earlier, and I think you're just emphasizing it now, is that the building trust is not necessarily building likability and enjoyment, and that sometimes the best way to build trust is to ask the hard questions, but have the hard questions informed and dictated by what the other person is trying to accomplish and
Right.
what they need to consider in order to accomplish that maybe they hadn't considered. So can
Right.
you elaborate on that? Because I agree with you completely that that building trust isn't some superficial. It's interesting. I had Jordan Peterson on.
Okay.
Another Canadian.
Yes, we're everywhere.
That's right. And you haven't said or I'm sorry yet, but you probably will.
Yeah, I'm saving them up.
There you go. You can save them. But one of the things Jordan said, and I highlighted it, is he said to give your child unconditional empathy, as in they're wonderful, does them a disservice.
Yeah.
To give them feedback that the world is not going to give them, that will unprepare them for what the world will be, you're doing them a disservice. I recently heard him in another interview, and he said, part of your role as a parent is when you discover there's things about your kid that you really don't like. I mean, you love your child, but if you don't like those things about your kid, there's a good chance the world's not going to like them for those things. And you owe it to your child, even if it results in arguments, you owe it to your child to do everything you can to help them correct that, eliminate it, or whatever.
Right.
Because not doing it is doing them a disservice. So, can you spend a little time on drilling into, I don't know if you'd call that tough love.
Right.
Yeah, but say more about that.
Yeah. So I spend a lot of time thinking about trust and parenting, because it's the overlap of the two things I care most about. I agree with Jordan Peterson that, false platitudes and just, oh, you're wonderful all the time, huge disservice. But creating an environment where you can give feedback and have it actually land, which is often a challenge for us as human beings. So being able to give feedback to your kids or to your partner or to your employees in a way that doesn't provoke defensiveness, that doesn't leave them feeling damaged and despondent. I talk about having a relentlessly positive story about my kids. That doesn't mean that I never give them feedback. It means that I interpret new information about them in a positive light. And then I get them to think about the world and how it may react to them. My sons both have different types of learning disabilities. And I sat down with them when they were young teenagers, and I said, okay, so right now the school's making accommodations for you, but do you know who's going to care about these things when you get out of high school? No one. The world is not going to adapt to you. You have to adapt to the world. And you have to figure out how you're going to function and perform in society. Now, I can report that both of my sons, my oldest son got his baseball scholarship, and he went from the west coast of Canada to Missouri. He's going to school at a small university just north of St. Louis, and it's a Baptist university. Now, he's not a Baptist, and Canada is slightly to the left on the political spectrum from the US. And so Missouri is further right than other regions of the US. And so he entered this environment where there's the potential for all kinds of challenges, and he is thriving. He has been incredibly successful. And part of that is because I've helped him through modeling and teaching and conversation about trust and about relationships and about how to build them. He's built really strong relationships. And so I think that this is a way to future-proof our kids, to teach them how to build stronger relationships, how to connect and engage, because the world is changing at a really rapid pace. And so with my kids, when I give them feedback, I start off with, okay, so here's the things that went well. Now, would you like some feedback? And so I include them in that conversation. And every time they say, yeah, I'd like to get better. Okay, so here's a couple of things that you could get better at. And, there's this piece in us that wants to be like a snowplow, right? That clears all the obstacles for our children. That's also a disservice. And so it took me a while to learn, but what I try to do now is come alongside. And so what I used to do was say, oh, there's a rake, don't step on that rake. There's a rake, there's a rake. And I realized that what my kids were learning was dad knows where the rakes are. What they weren't learning was how to identify where a rake was and avoid it themselves. And so I took a bit of a step back, and I would then come alongside and say, oh, wow, you just stepped on that rake. That looked like it really hurt. What was it that caused us to get there? And what could you have done to avoid that? And now how do we recover? Because crap happens. It's how we respond that really matters. And so giving them that mindset of being curious, giving them that mindset of wanting to improve and get better, and giving them feedback in a way that they can accept it now, not 10 years from now when they look back and go, dad was really smart, he kept saying this. I need to engage them now. And so it's more of a relational approach than a command and control approach. And I've worked with so many different executives and leaders, and often the conversation comes around to, okay, I'm struggling with my kids. Not too long ago, I had a senior executive group, and one of the executives said the relationship I want to focus on, because what I do in my workshops and in my training and my coaching is I get people to pick someone to practice with, so that they're trying out the skills that I'm teaching them, because that's where the learning takes place. And so he said, I want to practice with my son. The relationship feels broken, and there's things going on in his life that I'm not crazy about. And we went through a 3-month program with this leadership team, and I was getting feedback from the team saying, okay, so how did things go? And this leader said, so what I didn't tell you is my wife was filing for divorce at the start of this program. And here we are 3 months later, we're closer than we've ever been. And the son that I wanted to work on just threw his arms around me, gave me the biggest hug I've ever had in my life, and said, I need you in my life. I'm so glad we're getting closer. That's how things are going. And so there's room for these things to improve, for us to get better, but we need to be intentional about it. We need to be thoughtful. And one of the things I really try to do is help people unpack something as complex as trust and make it simple, and give people things that they can actually do about it. Because for me, it's so rewarding and so powerful to see people making positive change. That's why I do it. And the reason I wrote the book is because I felt like I was dropping small grains of sand in the ocean, and I wanted people to come along and pick up great big rocks and create huge splashes, because trust is at the lowest levels we've ever seen, and we need it to fight the problems that we're facing, things like climate change and things like race relations, and things like the divide between political ideologies and pandemics. All of those things require a level of collective collaborative action. They need us to pull together, and we're not. And that creates a profound sense of disquiet in me. I feel like I'm a lone voice crying out in the wilderness, Mark. And I need people to come alongside and help.
If you're listening to this, you need to join in with Darryl and what he's doing. I've had some wonderful guests on the show, and they talk about trust. And one was Stephen M.R. Covey, who wrote The Speed of Trust, Smart Trust, Trust and Inspiration. And those are wonderful books. And,
right.
and I recommend them to people. if you're listening in, if trust is something that matters to you and you want to learn how to incrementally build it, I am mesmerized by Darryl right now. And I am certain that his book will be an elaboration of what we're just getting a taste of. So if you're listening in and trust is important to you, yes, check out Stephen M. R. Covey's great series of books. Check out Doug Conant, who is the former CEO of Campbell's Soup. He's been on the podcast a couple of times, and he said trust is the core of leadership and all that. So please, if you're listening in, check out them, but by all means, check out Darryl, because I mean, everything you're saying is just landing so well for me. And I'll just be open. My kids have done well, and I'm blessed, and most of the credit goes to my wife, but because I didn't have a parenting to me that was so thoughtful and calm and incremental the way you're describing it.
Right.
I didn't do that with my children because I didn't know how to do it or what to do. And I'm going to go home and tell my wife, we really dodged a bullet. or I really dodged a bullet because I just didn't do what you did.
Right.
And if my children, if you ever listen to this episode, thank you for forgiving me that I didn't do as good a job or as complete a job as Darryl did with his children and the people he works with. Give our listeners a little taste. Well, you've given them more than a little taste, but if someone's listening in and they're a leader,
right,
and they say, I agree with you. I agree with you theoretically, philosophically, hypothetically. What would be, give me a taste of beginning to build trust?
Right.
And give me, what would be an exercise if I'm a leader saying, you know, Darryl, you got me. I'm in. Even though you're not a salesperson, I'm sold on this thing. What would be a step that I could try? Because you had me at hello,
right,
and I'd like to put it into effect. So can you give us a couple nuggets that leaders who listen in might be wanting to try?
Right, absolutely. And so I believe that there are levers that we can pull to build trust. We are all capable of building trust. Some are just better than others. And what I do is I try to help people move along the continuum from wherever I find them to a better place. So those who aren't very good have a lever that they pull. Usually it's the ability lever. So they'll tell you what their credentials are, what their background is, what role they have in the organization, how much experience they've got, all those things. But there are 12 levers. I list 10 in the book, but there's 12. And those who are a little better have multiple levers that they pull. Those who are really good have multiple levers and they know when to pull which one. And so what I try to do in the book as clearly as I can is lay out, here's 10 levers. Here's how you pull them. So chapter 5 describes the model completely. Chapter 6 tries to go into application. And then the last 3 chapters are case studies showing about, here's where I came in and tried to diagnose and resolve a problem. And the question you ask is, if I'm a leader, how do I actually start to build trust? Well, I worked with a leader whose company measured trust levels. And the scale was -100 to 100. And that leader started out at 13. So not great. And so I started engaging with that leader, talking to them through the trust model. And then I sat down with their team and I said, here's what trust is, and here's how it works. And now let's go through, the levers that are most commonly spoken about. And this, you'll see this in Covey's work. was actually initially written by a guy named Roger Mayer and his colleagues in 1995. They wrote a seminal work on trust. And that's where most of the trust literature is. And it talks about three levers: benevolence, integrity, and ability. And those are all ways to reduce uncertainty. And so benevolence is you have my best interest at heart. Integrity is you're going to follow through on your promises and your actions actually align with the values that you express. And ability is I'm good at this. I have the competence to follow through on my promises. And so a lot of times what I will suggest for leaders is if you want to build trust, start with a conversation. And we give people templates for conversations, and I'll give the template now for your listeners for the first conversation. And usually it's, hey, I was listening to this podcast, Mark Goulston's amazing podcast, and I heard this guy talk about trust. And it has me thinking about being more intentional in my relationships, trying to build stronger relationships because I realize how much they matter. And that should provoke a response from the other person. They should go, oh, well, that's kind of interesting. What did they say? And now you've started an engagement with that person. And you say, you know what? This guy said that trust was the willingness to make yourself vulnerable when you can't completely predict how somebody else is going to behave. And so there's elements of uncertainty and vulnerability there. And that had me thinking about, what's the uncertainty in some of my relationships? Like, I often know exactly what I'm thinking and doing, but maybe I don't communicate that as well as I could. Are there times when you're sort of wondering, geez, why did you make that decision? Or why did you say that? Well, yeah, I guess I have that with everyone. Right. So what are some of the things I could do to reduce that? And, if I'm a leader and I'm talking to one of my subordinates, I could say, I know I'm vulnerable to you because the more senior I become, the less direct control I have over outcomes, the more dependent I am on the people that report to me for my success and my objectives and, this team functioning properly. So I'm really aware of how vulnerable I am to you. But how are you vulnerable to me? And now we start having this conversation where we're starting to unpack these things where you say, well, I give you your job descriptions and I assign tasks to you and those kinds of things. But are there other ways, right? Because if we think about the vulnerability that someone experiences at work, it's about their sense of self, their goals and aspirations, their relationships that they have, the bills that they pay. So all of those Maslow hierarchy of needs are being addressed in one way or another. And so what I suggest for folks is be a little bit vulnerable first by starting a conversation like this. And we're not talking about gaping chest wounds here. We're just talking about opening a conversation and then show some benevolence. And, part of that conversation goes like, and people can reframe this to however it fits for them, but being able to say something like, one of the things he talked about was benevolence. And having people's best interest at heart. I think I do that, but it doesn't always seem to land that way. Have you ever experienced that? And people will go, oh God, yes, because we all have. And then you'll say, well, he talked about actually including the other person in the conversation. So have you ever had somebody really act in your best interest? What was that like? What did they do? How did it feel? And now we're starting to get hints about what benevolence looks like for that person. And then you say, okay, well, what would it look like if I was benevolent to you? What does success look like for you? How do I help you get there? And so we've taken this sort of broad conversation and narrowed it down in a funnel to the point where we're able to ask that question and we've provoked the thought for the person. And now we're able to say, I want to help. And once that person has articulated that for us, then we're able to be transparent moving forward. We can say, remember when you told me you were hoping you'd get a promotion? Well, I've got a couple of tasks for you that's going to raise your profile within the organization. And it's geared at helping me justify giving you a promotion when the time comes. Because here's the other people that are involved in that conversation. Oh, okay. And so now we've made this direct link because we interpret the world through stories. Well, we're going to try to create a story together, you and I, that is one of us trying to build a stronger relationship together so you can interpret my actions in that way. and I'm going to try to be benevolent to you, and I want to make sure it lands. And so those are some of the tips that I would give. And when we go through it, it was a 12-week program. We've turned it into 2 8-week programs. But when we go through, we give people a little bit of theory, a little bit of experience, and then some template questions to ask. And so it helps them sort of practice some of these skills. And they'll say, felt awkward at first, but wow, was the response ever positive? And now I'm engaged, and partway through the experience, week 4 or week 5, they'll say, okay, so that relationship's going really well. Practice relationship, much better. Now I've started to realize that I can apply this stuff to every other relationship in my life. And people are starting to notice. They're starting to say, wow, you're showing up differently. And that's what we have control over, is how we approach the world. If our boss is a jerk, we don't control them, and we don't control how they show up in the world. What we do control is how we show up in the world. And we get different responses based on how we engage.
I was mesmerized about 20 minutes ago, and I'm astonished. I'm going to do everything in my power to get what you're doing out in the world.
Oh, thank you, Mark.
Well, the world needs it.
It does.
The world needs it. Yeah. So where can people find out more about you, what you're doing, and the best way to contact you?
So they can reach out to me at Darryl@trustunlimited.com, DARRYL. And the website is trustunlimited.com. And there's a blog section there with articles that I've written, podcasts that I've done. They won't be as good as this one, but there are others. And then get a copy of the book. It's available in hardcover or ebook or audio. And I welcome anyone who wants to help me carry some big rocks.
If you're listening in, I'm going to ask you a favor. I don't know that I ask favors of my listeners. Support Darryl. Support his work. We started the podcast where I said that some people I know that both Darryl and I know were kind of cynical, saying, we don't even expect trust. We feel naive and foolish to trust. We just expect people to not lie to us. And then if they do, we sue them. And that's how we started this journey today. And Darryl has taken us, he's taken me onto a journey to being hopeful and optimistic. And I hope if you've listened in, you've had the same experience. So thank you, Darryl.
Thank you so much, Mark.
And thank you to our listeners. Take good care. This is called My Wake-Up Call. I hope this episode woke you up into how much the world needs to be more trusting, and how they need a way to make that happen. And I think Darryl's work is one of the best ways to do that. So please support him. And thank you again for supporting the podcast, and always helps to share comments. And I greatly appreciate that, because I'm always wanting to do an even better job supporting you, and you're giving us the gift of your time. So until next time, everyone, take good care.